Capcom and SNK, two of the most important companies in the history of fighting games. From Street Fighter to King of Fighters, their contributions to the genre are expansive. So when the two entities began working together on projects, many considered this the stuff of dreams. Recently on this channel we have already looked at the two huge Capcom produced Capcom vs SNK games, so with this in mind, it's time to look at a collaboration on the SNK side of things. Holding these thoughts, hello ladies and gentlemen, Big Daddy Top Hat here. This is the story of SNK vs Capcom SVC Chaos, a game that at one point felt would be impossible. Yeah. As discussed on this channel in previous episodes, a deal will be struck between Capcom and SNK which would allow each company to produce one game each, using each other's licenses. On the Capcom side of this, it resulted in a Capcom vs SNK fighting game, while SNK would produce a card game to help promote their Neo Geo Pocket range. These crossovers proved fruitful enough for this relationship to continue, with further card games being produced, a Neo Geo Pocket fighting game being produced, and yet another fighter produced by Capcom, the legendary Capcom vs SNK 2. But there would be yet another big fighting game that could be experienced on home consoles, which we are heavily spotlighting today. I am of course talking about SVC Chaos. But what may come as a shock to those who do not already know this story is that SVC Chaos was neither developed or published by Capcom or SNK, but instead another company known as Playmore. So what on earth was going on here then? Well, to bring you up to scratch, the late 90s and early 2000s was a very tough time for SNK. The company would make mistake after mistake, with these mistakes eventually catching up with them. You see, in the build up to this relationship, SNK had made lots of questionable business moves, including launching the failing Neo Geo CD home console, the failed polygon-based Hyper Neo Geo arcade system, and of course their underperforming Neo Geo Pocket handheld range that didn't shape up to be the Game Boy alternative they had hoped for. In fact, by January of the year 2000, SNK's poor financial status would lead to the company being acquired by a corporation known as Aruze Gaming, leading to the darkest period for SNK games yet. If you're not aware of them, Aruze is a company known for manufacturing pachinko machines. This acquisition was mostly driven so that Aruze could feature King of Fighters characters on their pachinko devices, which made sense considering both King of Fighters and pachinko were both popular in Japan. SNK, now under Aruze's control, would downsize the gaming side of the company's business and would cease all American operations by June of that year. Rights to the distribution of their arcades in the region were sold, and the localization of releases for their console games was sold to outside companies. Through all this, a mass exodus of SNK employees would take place, with many of their best and brightest jumping to Capcom, and others founding their own development houses, such as Dimps for example, who would ironically be the company who SNK would allow to develop Match of the Millennium. During this dark age, SNK would hemorrhage employees, including one group of staff leaving to make a development house known as Brizasoft, which would win the rights to develop games such as King of Fighters 2001. During this period of turmoil, even SNK founder Akichi Kawasaki would leave, who, like others, he too would form a new company. In his case, in August of 2001, Playmore would be born, the very company who would make SVC Chaos. But before we get to talking about the game itself, there is a little more important history that we need to touch on. By October 2001, SNK under Aruze would end up in an even worse financial situation, leading to SNK filing for bankruptcy. This would result in them having to put all of their intellectual property rights for its franchises up for auction. But in an awesome twist, none of this ended up as tragically as it sounds. The winning bid for SNK's intellectual property rights would be won by Playmore, the company owned by Kawasaki, and the very same man who was the brand's original owner. From here, Playmore would even go as far as to hire back many SNK employees and would acquire Brizasoft and other development houses where they had gone to work. In this period of mass reconstruction, distribution deals and new international offices were re-established around the world, including a return to the USA. Operating under the new name SNK Neo Geo by 2002, Kawasaki would pick up another astonishing win, and perhaps his biggest yet. That year, he would successfully manage to sue Aruze for 6.2 billion Japanese yen, due to the fact that they were continuing to use SNK intellectual properties on their bloody pachinko machines. After the acquisition, retrospectively, SNK found that Kawasaki really did get the ultimate revenge on the company that drove the brand he built completely into the ground. What a turnaround. So what for the SVC Chaos game that would emerge from amongst the chaos? Let's find out.
SVC Chaos SNK vs Capcom.
A pretty hype intro if I do say so myself, showcasing Street Fighter and King of Fighters flagship boys facing off against one another. From the player select screen, the original arcade version of this game, it instantly opens up by offering the player a choice of 24 different fighters. However, when you include bosses and secret characters, the roster offers up a total of 36 different ones to choose from, which is nice. The game is both artistically and graphically very different from Capcom's offerings from 2 years earlier, with the entire game graphically being produced in the style of King of Fighters at the time rather than Street Fighter like with Capcom's efforts. Changes do not end here though, as the gameplay is very different too. The game draws heavily from King of Fighters 2002, meaning that it takes advantage of a 4-button configuration, with many of the same techniques being carried over. The 4-button system incorporates light and strong kicks, punches, cancels and charging attacks. Different from the regular King of Fighters formula though, the traditional team battle format is not carried over, with it instead offering players simple round-based one-on-one encounters. Teddy Long was not amused. All matches start out with some dialogue with lots of trash talking between the fighters, resulting in a crazy number of different dream confrontations unfolding. Some of these are absolutely wild, such as Chun-Li threatening to arrest Mai Shiranui for indecent exposure, and Balrog assaulting her after she refuses his offer to become his queen. There are plenty of interesting showdowns here. In terms of completely new mechanics that the game would introduce, a technique would debut known as the front grand step, a manoeuvre that would allow players to cancel attacks with a forward dash. This can be executed while guarding from an opponent's move, but will consume 1 power gauge level. Speaking of the game's power gauges, the ones featured in this game are known as the Groove Power Gate system. These gauges consist of 3 levels that fill up when a player both lands and blocks attacks. Unlike the Capcom vs SNK games, SVC Chaos features no air guards and has no traditional groove system, with the game instead focusing on quicker gameplay. Going back to the gauges, when the gauge is filled to either the first or the second level, players have the ability to perform special moves, guard against cancel attacks, and even guard against guard cancels from step maneuvers. When the gauge is filled up all 3 levels and it's at max power, your character reaches a state known as max activation. During this phase, a timer is activated and the character has the ability to cancel any of their moves at any time, as well as still being able to perform super special moves and guard cancels. When the time expires, the gauge simply returns to level 2. Further from the super special moves, characters also have something known as exceed moves, additional attacks that can be executed when the player's life bar is less than half. These basically function as desperation maneuvers. Like previous crossover games between these two brands, this title's fighting roster is extremely King of Fighters and Street Fighter 2 heavy, which begs the question as to why they never simply called the earlier title Street Fighter 2 vs King of Fighters in the first place, as that is certainly the main sources where most of the characters have been taken from anyway. To be fair to SVC Chaos, this game has more characters from elsewhere than others from the 2 corporate entities, so let's touch on some of these additional characters, starting with those who are available in the game's initial 24. Regarding character selection on the SNK side of things, they present several characters from the Samurai Showdown series, including Earthquake from the first game, Genijuro from the second, the most quirky of all Shiki from the failed Samurai Showdown 64 game for the Hyper Neo Geo arcade hardware. Now that's niche. Capcom would present 2 non-Street Fighter characters in their initial lineup, which would consist of Hugo from Final Fight, who does appear in Street Fighter 3 anyway to be fair, but more quirkily, Tessa, a sorcerologist from a more obscure Capcom fighting game known as Red Earth, a title we have looked at here in depth in the past. The 12 characters not up for initial selection from the game are all varieties of different boss characters that can be accessed to fight against in different ways, who we will now begin discussing. The game has 4 regular end boss characters who one may encounter depending on who they play as on the Capcom side of things. These include Shin Akuma, a powered up version of regular Akuma, and Violent Ken, who has more recently been included in Ultra Street Fighter 2 on the Nintendo Switch. Interestingly, this was the first time the character ever appeared in a game after taking inspiration from a form of Ken which was included in the Street Fighter 2 manga previously, Brainwashed Ken. SNK bosses consist of Orochi Ori, who has also appeared in all of the other Capcom SNK crossover games, and secondly, the ridiculous Serious Mr. Karate. Moving on from the standard boss encounters, the game also features mid-boss encounters too. In order to face off with these mid-bosses, various requirements must be met, such as using an Exceed attack for example. Out of the mid-bosses, we have Geese Howard and Dan Hibiki returning to the game. Gonitz from King of Fighters 96 is also present here, but then we have some more refreshing characters too. These include Dimitri from the Darkstalkers series, which makes a change from simply getting Morrigan in everything, Mega Man Zero from the rather underrated Game Boy Advance series, and the freaking Mars people from Metal Slug 2. Talk about a quirky choice for a fighting game. Finally, the third type of boss are secret ones. These are once again accessible by reaching certain requirements and appear at the end of a playthrough like Akuma in Super Street Fighter 2 Turbo. There is one Capcom representative in this category and one from SNK. SNK brings to us Athena from the 1986 game Athena. Athena is significant and was popular in Japan at the time for being gaming's first ever bikini-clad heroine. So with her popularity in mind, she was a decent addition to this game's roster. Finally, Capcom brings to the table a secret boss in the form of the gargoyle known as Red Arima, who is featured in both the Ghosts and Goblins series and the game spin-off known as Gargoyle's Quest. These are very fun and surprising additions to the game. All of these characters are drawn using the King of Fighters art style and fight it out on a range of stages that suggest that the setting takes place in a post-apocalyptic Earth, with most stages appearing to be abandoned, decrepit and mostly devoid of life, all in all giving the game a unique aesthetic and feel that separates it from all of the other Capcom SNK crossover games. Whilst the game was released in the arcades in 2003, it was developed to run using an NVS arcade board, meaning that the game ran on tech that had debuted 13 years prior. So with this in mind, the game arguably does not look as good as Capcom's SNK crossover games, as they run on the much newer and more technically impressive Sega Naomi hardware, the counterpart to the Sega Dreamcast rather than the Neo Geo AES. Still, a counterpoint to all of this is that although the game looked dated on release, it has aged fantastically, as it features such a classic graphical style that is synonymous with SNK fighting. Also, with it obviously being an MVS game, this also meant that SNK could also release the game on their aging AES hardware, meaning that people who owned the AES could bring the exact arcade experience home on a cartridge. Very cool indeed. Thinking about it, it blows my mind slightly that new Neo Geo AES cartridges were still being made after the death of the Dreamcast, and into the era of the PS2 and Xbox. Talk about a cult system. Reviews for the MVS and AES version of this game from the time period are scarce, however I did manage to find one on GameTZ.com. They would comment that it took a little over a decade, but finally the two worlds of SNK and Capcom collide on the Neo Geo home console in the form of SNK vs Capcom Chaos. This highly anticipated game takes fighters from both sides and pins them against each other in an all-out battle. Their graphics are a mixed bag, the fighters are all animated very well, and there are plenty of spectacular looking moves and effects. The music is pretty good, with various rock tunes playing in the back. I've heard better come out of my Neo Geo, but it's still pretty good. In the end, aside from a few problems, this is a fighting fan's dream come true. To be able to match Terry Bogard against Ryu or Iori against Ken Masters on a Neo Geo is like a little slice of heaven. If you've got the cash to spend, $200-ish, I'd recommend picking this game up. SNK vs Capcom SVC Chaos would be the only fighting crossover game released by SNK or Playmore to be released on multiple platforms away from the company's own hardware. The game would also see release on both the Sony PlayStation 2 and Microsoft Xbox. However, the PlayStation 2 version of the game missed a North American release. I have read a number of sources online that Sony Computer Entertainment's American game approval policy would prevent the game being released on the hardware due to its basic two-dimensional graphics, whereas others say it was not approved simply due to 2D fighting games no longer being popular in the region. Regardless of this, a PS2 version of the game did make its way to Europe. Regarding the mainstream console releases, GameSpot would write, SVC Chaos combined tons of different characters from each publisher's respective decade-old fighting game franchises and lets them and you have at it in traditional one-on-one martial arts matches. Not only does SVC Chaos simply not play particularly well by the standards of 2D fighting games, but also the game's implementation of Xbox Live support is flawed. The main problem with the Live support is that you can't choose to have a rematch against the other player once a fight is over. That means as soon as you win or lose, you're first awkwardly prompted to either save the replay of the match or not, and then you're unceremoniously dropped at the Xbox Live main menu where you can choose from the standard quick match and Optimatch features all over again. Despite the problems with live functionality and the actual gameplay, SVC Chaos can still be pretty fun if you find yourself pitted against a similarly skilled opponent. As mentioned, SVC Chaos' cast of characters is obviously the main attraction. Instead of flimsy and ramshackle, SVC Chaos looks like a Neo Geo fighting game, and the venerable Neo Geo hardware is about 15 years old now, so don't expect to be dazzled by the visuals here. In fact, if you're a fan of SNK fighting games, then don't expect to see a ton of new graphics. It's a shame that one of SNK's first forays onto the Xbox and its first attempts at taking its fighting games online is with a game that's decidedly below par and yet still somehow promising. GameSpot would end up awarding the game 6.3 out of 10, which as you know is pretty low for a review score, but as you can see it was largely due to complaints about the graphical style, a feature of the game that in my mind at least has aged like a fine wine compared to a lot of content that can be found on the original Xbox. IGN2 would only give it 6 out of 10, stating, SVC Chaos SNK vs Capcom is a decent fighter with a stripped down fighting system that some may prefer over fancier, more combo-studded variations. Stripped down pretty much describes this game well. In most respects the graphics and sound aren't terrible, but then again they are also very old school in both their design and their technical approach. The online functions are probably the aspect that will really grab your interest and keep you playing well after you've beaten the game a zillion times. SNK vs Capcom holds up relatively well. Reviews across the information superhighway at the time seem to draw similar conclusions, with the biggest criticisms for the Xbox version being the online features not being particularly well implemented and the graphics looking like they've come straight from the past. Obviously, these are all perspectives that have come directly from the dawn of the noughties, the era whereby everyone only had polygon graphics fetishes. I like to think we are a little more cultured now. In my opinion, SVC Chaos stands out for being the only game ever to see release that lets you place the cast of Street Fighter 2 drawn in the King of Fighters art style being placed into the world of a King of Fighters playstyle. That in itself serves as a massive draw for me and an excellent reason for this game to exist and continue to be checked out. In those respects, the game is very unique, and it is also pretty novel that you can play using Street Fighter characters on the Neo Geo AES home system, a platform that some would argue to be the greatest home console of fighting games in the history of mankind. Looking at the game through a modern lens, the game's classical graphic style on display looks as beautiful as ever, and is far more appealing to look at than games that people were excited to look at the time, such as GTA 3 for example. SVC Chaos has aged about 10 times as gracefully. Anyway, if this is your first time here today, subscribe and check out my video on Capcom vs SNK 2, or maybe my more obscure Red Earth content. Cheerio!